Hey everyone, welcome to You Said What, where we look at the most memorable conversations and written interchanges in our lives. Today's guest is David Murray. He's a blogger, a speechwriter, an authority on rhetoric, and according to a blurb on Amazon at least, he's a professional curmudgeon, so we'll see. He's written and edited multiple books, most recently, An Effort to Understand Hearing One Another and Ourselves in a Nation Cracked in Half. David isn't your typical communications consultant, thought leader. When it comes to ways that people typically communicate or think about how they should communicate, he doesn't stick to the orthodoxy. We're going to talk about some of that, as well as this whole notion that we're taught at a young age on the playground that actions are more powerful than words. We're going to definitely get into that. First off, I just want to thank our sponsor, Pioneering Collective, an executive thought leadership firm combining personal PR and networking to transform hard-earned wisdom into heavyweight impact. You can learn more at pioneeringcollective.com. David, you have a great story to kick things off. I'll let you tell us about it.
Hi, Ernie. Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here. Yeah, I think this is a story that I grew up around in a communication family. I grew up in the 1970s when everybody was talking about communication, and Leo Buscaglia was all about telling each other we loved each other and saying all these things. And I grew up in a family like that, and I grew up a family of writers. So I kind of had this idea that words were everything. And that idea persisted into about half my adult life until I had a moment with my sister, my dear sister, who has known me since, well, I was 3 and she was 0. And she had this boyfriend for a while. And maybe 5 years she dated this guy. And, he was in our lives and we got to know him and we spent all this time with him. And she finally broke up with him after about 5 years. And I kind of casually said, well, yeah, it seems like a good thing. Seems like it wasn't a great match. And she turned to me and she said, why didn't you tell me that? Why didn't you tell me that it wasn't a great match and that I should break up with him and that you didn't like him? And I was like, well, first of all, it wasn't that I didn't like him, but you've known me your whole life. You know what it looks like when I'm interested in somebody. You know what it looks like when I am engaged by somebody and really like somebody. And also when I'm bored by somebody and when I'm struggling and when I'm doing my best to be nice to somebody. You know that. You don't need me to tell you in words that this isn't a compatible thing with us and with our family. You know that. And it struck me that was a much bigger, there was a big lesson in that. It led to what I call the everybody already knows everything theory of communication, which is that we really rarely need words to explain ourselves.
Did you consciously not communicate because you were going to say something that was going to maybe offend her? Or like what was going through your mind as you were not saying anything for those years, but you were speaking with your actions?
I was not trying to communicate with her through my actions. I was thinking, you've got this relationship, whatever's happening between you and him is happening between you and him, and it's my job to be as welcoming and loving to him as I possibly can. That's my job. My job is not to tell you, get rid of this guy, tie a can to this guy. My job is to be as supportive as I can. But then afterwards, do not come after me and say, I should have told you, because you knew, you should have known. Just based on my behavior and based on whether it was natural or not. We've talked about it, and she agrees with that.
Yeah, it's funny because we're told from a young age about the power of actions versus words, and yet we spend so much time thinking about words and crafting words, and I'm guilty of it too, obviously, being in the business I think that we're both in. Are you saying that we spend way too much time thinking about words and not nearly enough time thinking about actions? Is that part of what you're saying too?
Well, look, we're in the communication business, so we can't control the CEO's actions all the time. We can control the CEO's words, so it's kind of natural that we would, especially as executive communicators and people who are good at words, be thinking a lot about words. But it's also really important for us to realize that words alone do not define who these people are. Everybody's defined by a million things that they do and a million things that they never do. But that everybody watches a leader of a company, for instance. Where does that person park? Does that person park in the special parking lot, or does that person park in the back? Does that person go to the employee cafeteria ever? How long does that person talk to the administrative assistant? That person puts off 1,000 signs in an organization, and the words that the communicators use are often just sort of captions that go onto those actions. That's how we should think about our words. Our words are captions that go on the actions of the whole organization. And those captions can explain the actions of the CEO. You can put them in context, but they can't contradict the actions of the CEO. In the same way that, what would you rather have? A father or a mother who was home every day and played with you, or a father and mother who was always on the road and saw you once a month but said, I love you 50 times? That's what I mean by this. And I think that as communicators, we focus on words because words is what we control.
Do you work with some leaders who really get that and they understand? I mean, obviously every leader would tell you that their actions are important. I don't think anybody would not, but have you worked with some people that are like really good at thinking about how they show up, not just certainly in the big moments, but in small moments too? Do you see that in action sometimes?
I work with communicators who are really strong-handed with leaders, who tell leaders, look what it looks like when you show up in your corporate jet with your manicured fingernails and you walk into this warehouse where all these people have been toiling, they see themselves as the world sees them. That's what I work with. I mean, there's a leader who I love, and I think she's just the best example. And she's, fortunately, you can all see her. She's the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Her name is Jacinda Ardern. She's got this thing figured out. She's a wonderful speaker. She gives a great speech. In fact, she sort of got famous by giving a great speech. She and her team show her in 100 different ways. So you'll see her coming away from a meeting at midnight. She's on Facebook Live. I just came from this meeting. Here's what we talked about. Here's my assistants are with me. I just wanted you to know what happened at this meeting. She'll be telling the whole country that on FaceTime. Next time you see her, she's interviewing a health expert about COVID and about what's going on with COVID, or interviewing a psychological expert about the psychological effects of being in your house she was especially good on this on COVID. She was like a motherly Churchill. Every Sunday night, she would come to you from her bedroom, usually like in a sweatshirt. And one time she's saying, now my family doesn't know I'm in here doing this, but I just wanted to give you an update on what's going on with the COVID protocols this week.
That's
and it's
hilarious.
like, you are whispering to the country while your family in the other room doesn't know you're doing it.
It's like real life.
It's like real life. And she understands that it's not just what she's saying. It's where she's saying it. It's the fact that she's bringing us along in her life and letting us know that she's always thinking about us, and we see her listening. I love that idea. Leaders often think that communication is me talking. Communication can be you listening, can be you interviewing somebody smart. So I just think she totally gets what I'm talking about here. And if you're a citizen of New Zealand, you feel like you're her friend, and she's brought you along on a lot of business trips, and it's cool.
That's great. I mean, it takes a unique person to be able to pull that off and not have it show somebody's sides that you don't want to, obviously she seems like a really dynamic, interesting person where you kind of want to see as much of their life as possible. I'm not sure I could pull that off if I tried.
And I think there's different styles for different people. I mean, she really does kind of have a motherly vibe to her. But Churchill did it in his way too. People saw him in a bunch of different poses in a bunch of different ways. They didn't see him crying, which he did sometimes, but they saw him in situations, and he understood the power of that. And I think that's just so important. And when I advise communicators, I deal with a lot of speechwriters and a lot of executive communication people. I tell them, figure out who your leader is and where that person is most appealing, and animate that person. So yeah, you probably don't want your CEO whispering in the bedroom to a phone, but so many speechwriters say my CEO's nervous up at the lectern, but is so great in small conversations. Well, get a camera in while the CEO's having a small group discussion and show him interacting with all these people. Find ways to show these people at their very best. And some of these people are funny in small ways and not in big ways. And it's kind of up to the communicator's job to figure out how to show the best sides of this person.
You and I were talking about origin stories and about how they've become so ubiquitous. You have a strong feeling about that. Tell me about how it's sort of become absurd to a point. Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, origin stories are wonderful in the sense that they do an efficient thing. They do the thing that needs to be done, which is, an audience wants to know two things about their leader. They want to know why that person's up there, and why I'm down here. They want to know why that person's special. But they also want to know, in the same breath, does that person understand me? Is that person enough like me? So they want to know both those things. And they really want the person to be special, but they also really need the person to be common and like them. And so a good origin story kind of humanizes the leader and shows why that leader is where they are. Every TED Talk has an origin story usually, and we've gotten kind of addicted to the idea that there's this tidy origin story for every leader about something that happened to them when they were 4 years old, and that's why they're the head of NASA today. And it's gotten out of hand, and we've seen some ridiculous origin stories.
Tell me about one.
Well, there was one that was it was the one that jumped the shark. It was a big real estate executive who is unveiling the corporate strategy at this big employee town hall. And it's the brand new strategy, and he gets up and he tells a story about where this strategy came from. And he starts telling a story about when he was a little boy growing up in San Francisco. He would go climb on this mountain above San Francisco, the hill above San Francisco, and sit on a log and look out onto San Francisco and think to himself, what am I going to do with this world? And then somehow this leads to the real estate strategy that he's sharing with his audience today. And he then tells the story that just this morning I ran up the hill and sat on that log again. I mean, this is like preposterous stuff. And of course, the crowd ate it up. Crowds and employees want to believe in this stuff. They want their leaders to be special. They want their leaders to be like them. They want all this stuff to be true. But there are ways with more integrity that you can share that stuff. And a good origin story, if it's honest, if it's righteous, it's great. So like the perfect origin story was told at one of our speechwriters conferences that we put on. We had James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, and his speechwriter. They were speaking at our event, having a conversation. And the speechwriter told the story of being in a car with Jim Clapper 3 years after writing speeches for Clapper. And Clapper was not the most personable speaker, and getting him to talk about himself wasn't that easy. And Clapper was like bored in the back of the limousine, and he's like telling this story about when he was a kid and he was a military brat and he ended up moving to Philadelphia. His family moved him to Philadelphia and he didn't know anybody there and he was really lonely. And so he figured out on the dial on the TV, back then TVs had dials, if he got the dial between two of the numbers on his TV, he could hear the police radio in Philadelphia. And he figured out if he put a matchstick in there and held it there, he could really just listen to the police radio. And by 2 or 3 weeks later, he had all the 12 different police precincts all figured out, and he knew what was going on all over Philadelphia. And his speechwriter is sitting there looking at him going, took 3 years to tell me this story. Like, this story is your origin story. This story, A, humanizes you, shows that you were a sad and lonely little boy once, which the audience goes, oh my gosh, he's not just this imperious person who's sent down from heaven. He was a kid too. And it shows why you're the director of national intelligence. You were a spy when you were 13 years old. That's a great story. And if your leader has that story, my God, you tell that pretty much every speech. But most leaders don't have a story that tidy. What leaders do have, though, is something that truly animated them. Nobody gets to be the head of Chevron by accident. You know, these people are either running from something or they're running towards something, or there's a fire burning in these human beings, in every single one of these leaders. I don't care what organization they're leading. The speechwriter, the communicator needs to get to the core of that and figure out what fires this person. Is it a love of science? Is it a love of taking care of a community? Is it a whatever it is?
No, that makes sense. That's the job of the communicator. Why do you think it's hard for people to know what fires them up? You know, we've all had these conversations with people, and I think it doesn't really matter what industry they're in or what they do for work, where they have a long life and lots of stuff have happened. And once you start talking to them like Clapper, you can say, wait, that's the story right there. How come you've never told that? Or how come, there's sort of like, there's gold there. And why is it hard for people to see those inspirations in their own life and in their stories if they're such important things? An outsider can kind of see it really quickly, but it's hard sometimes to see yourself.
It is. I mean, I think it's also, we're disbelieving because we're communicators, and everything that happens to us fits into a story. Like, we are narrating. Every day is a narration for us. It's so natural for us to see life as a narration. And sometimes you talk to executives and they see life the same way. They go, oh, I know exactly when I wanted to be a banker. But so many of the other ones just look at you like with bovine eyes, and they have no idea what you're even talking about. So it's kind of your job to figure out what turns them on, and you can see what turns them on. I mean, even in a president of the United States, like when Barack Obama was president, you could see, if he was talking on a domestic issue that was something that he really cared about, you could tell he was like totally engaged. But he was standing next to Mohammed Karzai, you could tell he was like, okay, this is not why I wanted this job. And so when you see your leader do that, you should be encouraging that person to give speeches on that thing that gets them excited. And rather than come up with phony origin stories for them, you should be figuring out, okay, so what really drives them is they love to create a great culture here at XYZ company. This is really what turns them on. So let's have them talk about 3 employees who absolutely blossomed at this organization after they hadn't blossomed at other organizations before. And if they're talking about those employees or their customers or whatever in an animated way, all of a sudden their humanity comes out. They don't have to be talking about themselves when they were 5 years old. All of a sudden we see this leader saying, this woman is completely committed to this organization. Look at her up there. Right. And so it has more integrity, and I think it doesn't embarrass the leader. I think a lot of leaders are embarrassed to tell those kinds of adorable origin stories about themselves, and they can tell these other stories and really get across a lot of their humanity.
Well, I think when you see someone that's really genuinely brought alive by something, you see their passion and their energy for something, that's exciting, right? And so to have them connect with that, to have them connect to an audience over those things, I think is powerful. We've been talking a lot about external communications. There's also, of course, internal communications. You've written a fair amount about that. What's your vision of how that should look?
I found a book from the 1940s. I think it has a title, really lame, boring title, something like Sharing Information with Employees. But it described a 19th century furniture shop that I think is just a great metaphor for what you want to try to do with your employees and whatever size the company is. And in this 19th century furniture shop, there's 7 people who work there. And the 7 people, they know stuff. They know that owner because they grew up around there. They know how much the owner borrowed to even start the furniture shop. They know about the new order that's just come in and why it's really important. They know the basic dimensions of the company and financial situation. They know that if they do a good job on this piece of furniture, they know the customer. And they actually know that customer has enough money to buy another batch of furniture, probably. But they have to get that furniture good enough so that it competes with the other furniture that person once saw on a visit to Buffalo. Like, they know all this stuff. All the workers know all this stuff about this organization and what makes it work and what makes it tick. And that's what you want your employees to know. Even if they work at, a gigantic energy company, you want them to know the basic facts of the business.
Are you talking about just educating them about the context, or are you talking about having them be steeped in everything about the company? Is it sort of like people work at a company and they don't really understand enough about how things fit together, or who's doing what, or how this part of the business relates to that? Or are you saying like they should know the history cold, they should know, like, what are you suggesting?
You should try to make that company feel as much like that 19th century furniture shop where everybody knows basically what's going on here and why. They basically know the history of the company. They basically know who the owner is. They know him because they work right next to the person. They know how he acts, how he feels, how what a good day and a bad day is. They know who the customer is. They know intimately the customer, and they know the basic economics of the operation, and they know what the competition is like. It's hard to do that in a big, huge global company. But if you kind of break it down and say, yeah, but those basic elements can be done.
If you do this, then the upside is like more engagement and more commitment, or what's the or just like it's the right thing to do, or what's the upside of this?
The upside is more engagement, more commitment, more intelligent decisions being made by employees because they really know what's going on. They know how good they have to be. They know whether the company's under financial duress or not. Phrase that's repeated in this article about it is because they know, they understand. People want to know what's going on in their lives. I mean, my dad used to have a cartoon, on his refrigerator, and it was 2 guys pushing a pole round and round, and it went through a hole in the ceiling. And one guy says to the other, I don't know, I think they got a merry-go-round up there. That's how it feels to work in a lot of these huge organizations. And that's a shitty way to feel as an employee. Feeling like you're working for an organization that you basically understand what it's doing, what its impact is on the world, and what its challenges are, that's just a better feeling, especially if you're living in a democracy and wanting to feel like you're a living, breathing human being.
Do you think we become more focused on external communications at the expense of internal a little bit? I know there are different jobs and different people doing them, but are we skewed and tilted towards thinking about how the world views us versus building that community inside the business?
What I would say is, in terms of external and internal communications, they've very much come together over the last, and the whole time I've been studying this business, which is about 30 years. I mean, there used to be internal communications, and there was the internal newsletter, and then there was an external magazine, and never the twain should meet. Often, you'll see organizations, you saw this a lot during COVID, you'd see Walmart, for instance, publish on LinkedIn a letter that it had just sent to its employees. So the CEO has written to employees, here's the situation with COVID. Are we going to have some layoffs? Maybe we're doing this, and then they publish that letter on LinkedIn publicly. And I think that's a great relationship because, like, if you're external and you're trying to figure out what's really going on at Walmart, I'd rather read an internal memo than some glossy press release that Walmart's telling me because I'm some reporter somewhere. Okay, this is what they told their employees is going on. It seems more genuine and it's more integrated. So I've seen that external and internal, especially since employees are also activists and employees act very external. I mean, what goes on these internal forums, the amount of argument and political argument, and not even civilized political argument. I mean, it gets as bad as Twitter on some of these internal forums.
Well, and people get fired for it,
Yes, people get fired for it, and people don't get fired for it. I mean, it's really kind of a wild moment. So, employees, they're external activists at the same time. So I think you got to kind of treat all of this much more holistically in an integrated way.
What about all the political and social kind of swirling issues of the last, say, particularly 3 to 5 years? A lot of leaders that you talk to and that you read about have really stumbled as they try to figure out, do I talk about those head on? Do I just put my head down and not say a word about them? Is there a middle ground where you can talk about them, but in a safer way or in a responsible way? What is the strategy around kind of hot button issues if you're a leader running a company?
The growing consensus, and this is not perfect in any organization, and this is not a science. People have tried to make matrices and tried to make filters to figure out which issues we're going to talk about, which issues we aren't going to talk about. And every time they do it, it's imperfect. But the general idea is you should weigh in on issues that truly have some bearing on your organization in a specific way. So one of our great partners in this world is AARP. AARP, you can't find AARP weighing in on a lot of issues. Every single issue that AARP weighs in on is something that has to do with the aging population, with benefits for retired people. Everything connects with AARP. So all these organizations, they're always getting asked, weigh in on this, weigh in on that. They can't weigh in on all these things because they don't have honest positions on most of these things. The thing to do is to connect it as much as you can with your organization. And if it's something that has absolutely nothing to do with your organization, you issue a flat statement.
Well, let me give you an example. So Roe v. Wade, that's the kind of thing that I think a lot of leaders wanted to say something on one way or the other, whatever their position is. If you work at a healthcare company, but a company that has nothing to do with reproductive rights or anything in that zone, do you have an obligation to say something? Again, whatever you feel?
The way to deal with it differently is if you're Coca-Cola and it's about Roe v. Wade, you share, okay, this is our policy for our employees. We do or we don't pay for employees to go out of state to get abortions. That's our statement. If you're CVS, and it's truly an issue that affects every part of your company and that your company can affect by the way its policies are, then maybe your CEO says something about it because your CEO is an actual statesperson on this issue because that's CVS. CVS doesn't probably want to talk about global water supply, but Coca-Cola talks about global water supply, and the CEO probably has a personal position on that. So you put out boilerplate when your policy isn't any different than any other company in your position, and you focus on issues where you can actually have something substantive to say and something that you're doing about it.
Great. No, that makes sense. And I think it's hard to come up with a logical way to think about it, but that's as logical as any that I've heard.
It's as logical as any.
I think a lot of people say you should be authentic, which means you should just speak your mind on anything, and that seems really complicated. And then other people say, oh, you just stay out of it completely. And that seems like you almost can't do that in this world. So neither of the extremes really work. And you need, as you say, my heart goes out to people who are creating matrices, because that's certainly a decent way to think about it. But I think these things can obviously get way over matrix. But I like the way you're talking about, which is it a core thing for you or not? Maybe there are 3-4 things that are core for your business and that really relate to what you do, and the rest are not. And then you need to say something, but it's not a deep, long statement. It's not quite as passionate as it would be if it was something that was core to your business.
Exactly. And, one of the hard facts of the matter here is that CEOs are not prepared to do this. They went to business school. They majored in finance. They didn't get culturally literate, most of them. They didn't study sociology. They didn't read a lot of, they didn't get a liberal arts education. So who did get a liberal arts education? They're communications people, and their communications people have to have a heavier hand these days because these CEOs are utterly unprepared to weigh in on so many of these issues. They're rich guys, mostly guys. They're separated from the population by special elevators and jets, and they are not ready to figure out. They do not know what it means to engage on these kinds of issues in a sustainable way, and their communications people have to take a heavier hand than they ever have.
In your book, An Effort to Understand, you say that we should consider communication communications as more than a means of persuading others to our way of thinking. We should be thinking about it as a way of thinking all its own. What do you mean by that?
I mean that everything that we do as human beings, as communicators, but as just human beings, we should think of as a communication. So it gets back to what we said in the beginning. So I'm on Facebook. I've had a couple drinks. Somebody says something stupid on Facebook politically or whatever they say. I feel like lashing out or saying I've got something hilariously nasty to say to that person. Or I'm just in a bad mood. I feel like lashing out. I think we do so much more good by not saying a thing like that. If we think of ourselves as, and I mean every one of us, think of ourselves as every citizen. Like, what if every citizen was doing what I'm about to do right now? Or what if every citizen wasn't doing what I'm about to do right now? Then we could take more responsibility. I think a lot of people post things on Facebook and so all kinds of social media. They do nasty things because they think that they don't have a lot of influence, and they think this is their only little thing, and they're only one person, and they came up with this one thing they need to say, and they have a huge influence. Every one of us has a huge influence and a huge ability to either put poison in the world or to put goodness into the world. And I think that we don't think of ourselves that way. We all think of ourselves as less influential than we are. Every single Tom, Dick, and Harry has 500 Facebook friends. And if you behave badly out there, if you behave badly on social media, that has a terrible effect. And so I just think of my life as a communication. The way I live it, what I do and don't do, tells everybody around me what I think is good and what I think is bad. And it's a great example.
Well, do you go through a different level of analysis when you are thinking about saying something or doing something then, because I know what you're saying is, be mindful of what you're about to do. Take a second before you send that email, that angry rant, like sleep on it. It's the extension of that to your whole life. Like just think about what you're doing and whether you'd like people to be doing more of it or less of it or whatever, if you were on the other end. Do you find that you are very consciously thoughtful about everything you do, or it's more just like you're kind of steeped in communication, so you're just like, it's sort of a little bit second nature now in terms of whether I do this or don't do that?
I think it's second nature, but it takes a fair amount of concentration and actual that I really haven't felt like I've had to do in the last until the last few years. I spent most of my career as a writer being a provocateur. I love Hunter S. Thompson. I love H.L. Mencken. I like these flame-throwing people. I think that's fantastic. And I did a ton of that myself. Mencken would write something crazy and he would just say, this is just to stir up the animals. I think the animals are pretty well stirred up right now. And I don't think they need stirring up. I think they need calming down. And so it's been, for me as a writer, not just as a Facebooker, but as a writer, if I'm going to write something that's a shot across somebody's bow, is that what's needed here right now? Or can I find some common ground between two people? It's fun to read Hunter S. Thompson, but I don't think we need Hunter S. Thompson right now.
So that's kind of the thing. I mean, that's an interesting point, because I think you're right. Like, we definitely need more coming together, not more pulling apart. But at the same time, there's like more content than ever out there. You hit on the second challenge with this, which is like, if you're writing a lot of stuff that's obvious or expected or incredibly feel good, sure, it could be popular or well read, but there's also a chance that it just disappears and becomes utterly unmemorable. And so that's not to say that you have to take shots at all, anybody, but you do have to figure out how to differentiate what you're saying from other things if you want to pop out a little and just be a part of discussion, right? And so I guess the challenge is managing that. There's no really need to be nasty or take shots across the bow, but you want to figure out how to be thoughtful enough to be adding to what's already been said, right?
And be incisive. Yeah. Humor helps with that. Being funny helps with that. Confessing to your own sins, your own political excesses helps with all that. I just think that as a writer, as a person in public, or as a person in your office or your workspace or in your community, what parts of me does this community need right now? Does this community need the hothead right now? Maybe that's what it needs. Sometimes that's what a community needs. It needs a hothead. It needs somebody to light a fire under it and to make fun of the idiots in it. I just think in general, our communities need more soothing parts of our personality these days, because everything's just at 10 right now.
Yeah, 100% agree, David. And thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great to talk with you about all these issues and get your thoughts.
Ernie, it was my pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
David had such a great point about playing to your strengths when you communicate. You don't need to tell the same stories that everyone else tells. Figure out what animates you, what makes you different from other people, and then lean into that to build a story or stories around that stuff. It's also true about different speaking formats. You may be in your element, speaking in front of 1,000 people on stage, but maybe you're more suited to doing a fireside chat, or you really love smaller conversations with groups of employees. As long as you know what you want to say and what you want to convey, any of those formats can be as effective as the next. If you've got a cool communications experience that had a big impact on you, email me. I'd love to feature you on the show. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe to You Said What. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.